this is Kenny Tan. Welcome to Real Estate License in 14 Weeks. This is episode 19 of Starting from Zero. We're going to continue to talk about chapter 5 on financing. Now today we're going to talk about the different types of mortgages and trust deed regarding the transfer of this type of mortgages trust deed. And we're also going to talk about real property sales contract. If you like my video, please give me a thumbs up and also subscribe to my video, my channel, and don't forget to click the bell and share this video with your friends. Today we're going to talk about transfer of trust deed or mortgage. A mortgage or trust deed can be transferred sometimes. The first concept we're going to learn is called assumption. There's a type of loan that is known as FHA loan. FHA loan is a type of loan that can be assumed. What does assumption really mean? Let's say a seller is interested in selling his property and he has an FHA loan that he got when he bought the property. And a buyer comes along, a buyer asks the seller if he can assume the FHA mortgage. So what does exactly does assumption mean? Assumption means that the buyer will take over the loan for the seller, such that the seller will no longer be obligated to make any more payments on the loan. That's what assumption means. It's a takeover. However, in order for the buyer to assume the loan, generally speaking, the lender needs to qualify the buyer. So there is a qualification process for the buyer to assume the loan. So that's what assumption means. The other type of transfer is known as subject to. What does subject to really mean? Let's say the seller, the same scenario, the seller also has a loan against the property, but it is the type of loan where it cannot be assumed by the buyer. Not every loan is assumable. Some loans are assumable and other loans are not. So if the loan is not assumable, however, the buyer himself perhaps cannot qualify for a loan. So the buyer approaches the seller and asks if the seller would be willing to sell the property to the buyer subject to the trust deed. When it says subject to, it means that the buyer doesn't take over the loan. The seller is still responsible for making payments on the loan. So that's the difference between assumption and subject to. Assumption, buyer takes over. Subject to, buyer does not take over. The seller can. The next type of mortgage, it's called the blanket mortgage or blanket trust deed. So what is a blanket mortgage? A blanket mortgage is one trust deed or mortgage that is secured by multiple parcels of property. Well, how does that happen in real life? So it happens mostly in construction real estate, in commercial real estate, where some lenders, because they want more security from the buyer because they don't feel comfortable with the borrower's credit worthiness. So what they do is they make the buyer put up several different properties as security for just one single loan. That's known as a blanket mortgage. So one mortgage that is secured by more than one parcel of properties. What is an all-inclusive trust deed? An all-inclusive trust deed, for short, is also known as an AITD. And it's also known as a wraparound loan. The easiest way to illustrate to you how an AITD works is to give you a real-life example that I was involved in. A few years ago, I think it was around 2016, I represented a couple of buyers that were interested in buying a horse property. It's a unique property. It is one of those property where my buyers could not get a loan for. However, it is also one of those property that the seller was having a difficult time finding a buyer. So it was a perfect situation for an AITD. So how does an AITD really work? Well, what the seller needed to do is to sell the property to someone, take some money, and use that money to buy his next home. But because he couldn't find a buyer who will qualify for a loan, then came my buyers. So the asking price was $2.6 million. At that time, the seller had a loan for $1.1 million. So how can we structure a deal where the first loan doesn't have to be paid off because my buyer could not qualify for a loan and my buyer doesn't have $2.6 million. All my buyer had was $1 million. So if my buyer was to buy this property and needed some kind of seller financing from the seller, he would need to borrow $1.6 million from the seller because $1 million plus 1.6 will make up the $2.6 million that he needed to put together in order to buy the property. So he will put down 1 million and then he would get a second deed of trust from the seller. In other words, the seller will be the lender. So he borrowed $1.6 million, but of the $1.6 million principal and the monthly payment that my buyer makes to him, if my buyer makes an installment payment on the $1.6 million to the seller, that amount of money that my buyer pays to the seller is enough to cover whatever that the seller owes to the lender. Remember, it's not a payoff situation because we don't have a loan and we don't have the full $2.6 million to pay to the seller. So what the seller did was the seller actually take the $1 million cash that he got from us and buy his next property. In the meantime, we make payments to him based on a principal of 1.6. And that monthly payment that the seller received from my buyer, he has enough money to pay his lender. In other words, the original lender was not paid off. So in other words, the original loan was wrapped within the second trust deed. That's why we also call an AITD a wraparound loan. Now, another thing I want to talk about blanket mortgage earlier, I forgot to mention is that, and you should add that to the blanket mortgage, is that whenever you have a blanket mortgage situation, please remember it is important to negotiate a release clause with the lender. Remember release clause because it is in the DRE exam. Release clause is always associated with blanket mortgage. I'll give you an example. I'm a developer. I want to borrow money from the bank to develop the project. And because sometimes the project has multiple parcels of property. So when I borrow money from the bank, I naturally want the bank to loan me money for all of these parcels. So I would essentially get a blanket mortgage from the lender for all of these parcels. So when I build the homes, in order for it to work for me, I have to negotiate a release clause with the lender, such that each time when a property is sold, I will release a certain amount to the bank, and then the bank will give me a release of, they'll give me a partial reconveyance on the loan. That's how it's going to work. Remember release clause. Next, let's talk about loan priority. A first trust deed and second trust deed. How do you know which one is first, which one is a second trust deed? Whenever you have multiple deeds of trust recorded against one single property, someone would have to be first and someone would have to be second. It's easy. The one that is recorded first is the first trust deed. The one is recorded second is the second trust deed. So another term that you have to remember is called a junior trust deed. A junior trust deed is a trust deed that is not in the first position, so that's easy to remember. Another type of financing is called a real property sales contract. What is a real property sales contract? A real property sales contract, it is nothing more than an installment sales contract. Let's say I want to buy a property from a seller and I don't have any money at the moment. I basically just inherited a sum of money that I will get through the probate court, but I don't have the money yet. But the seller knows that eventually I'm going to get the money. I'll be able to pay him. So one way for me to buy property from the seller is do what we call a real property sales contract, an installment sales contract. It's been known by many other names: land sale contract, land contract of sale, agreement for purchase or sale. All of these terms that are in the book, describe the same thing, describes real property sales contract. And this is how it works. Let's say, for example, I'm buying a property for $1 million. Now, usually when people get involved with real property sales contract, the buyer actually pays for the property at a price that is higher than the market value in order to justify the seller letting the buyer pay by installment. For example, if the property sales price is $1 million, they can sign a real property sales contract whereby the buyer can pay $100,000 a year. Now, if the buyer pays $100,000 a year, it will take the buyer 10 years to completely pay off the seller. Before the seller is paid off, who retains legal title to the property? The seller does. So at all times, the buyer does not have legal title to the property, but the buyer have what we call equitable title. So there is another name for the buyer. He is known as the equitable owner to the property. It's in the book. We also have some terminologies to describe the seller and the buyer. The seller is known as the vendor. The buyer is known as the vendee. Now, if a term ends with OR, usually that means a giver. If it ends with an ER, it means a recipient. So in the case of a real property sales contract, who is the giver? The giver of the title is the seller. So that's why we call the seller vendor. And the recipient of the title is the buyer. That's why we call the buyer the vendee. So remember, vendor means the seller, vendee means the buyer. What happens if the buyer does not make the installment payment? Let's say the buyer makes one payment for $100,000, and then the next year, the buyer doesn't make any payment. So the buyer is in default. So whenever the buyer is in default, what can the seller do? Remember, in a real property sales contract, the seller retains the title. The only time the seller gives up on the title is after the buyer had made all the 10 installments. So in this case, the buyer had made one installment and then he defaulted. Now, if a buyer defaults, what the seller can do is the seller can evict the buyer from the property, and we call that unlawful detainer. It's in the exam. So on a real property sales contract, whenever the buyer defaults, the seller will go to court and file an unlawful detainer action. Now, what happened to the $100,000 that the buyer paid previously? That is forfeited by the buyer. The buyer cannot take back the $100,000. This is the end of episode 19, and thank you for watching episode 19. I'll see you next time.